What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that's both fast-paced and entertaining. Today's video, we took some more games from our stream over on twitch.tv, check it out if you want to watch these games live, and decided to edit a few of them together for a video for you today. The timestamps for the two games are on screen now, and just keep in mind that the second game is just a little bit of a faster paced one, and also at the same time a little bit less of a serious game, so it's just another shorter game that is really just a freebie for you. Wanted to throw it in somewhere, and this seemed like a good spot for it. That being said, before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions for Game 1, I want to go over our channel promotions really quickly. First off, if you like what we do and want to help support us, we have merch available over on our website, casuallycompetitivemtg.com, and we have a Patreon available for those who want to support us in that way. We also have a TCG affiliate link in the description. If you are looking to buy cards, after clicking on that link, any purchases you make help out the channel at no cost to you. And finally, if you do want to get to know us and join our community, there's a public Discord link in the description below. That all being said, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first is Bill playing a deck that he calls Sad Farm. The main goal of this deck is to use Tymna's ability and all the mana dorks he has to generate constant card advantage, and then using his other partner commander Ikra Shidiqi in order to keep his life total high and healthy so he can utilize cards like Ad Nauseam or Necropotence or Villas Broker of Blood in order to generate even more value. This deck wins off of a Sickening Dreams Angel's Grace combo or through something like a Leonin Relic Warder in an Animate Dead. Bill's opening hand contained a Mana Crypt, a Fin-Torn Elves, an Elves of Deep Shadow, an Arcane Signet, an Abrupt Decay, a Blood Artist, and a Life Death. Going second is Joseph playing what is known as Blood Pod, which is the partner commanders Tymna the Weaver and Tana the Bloodsower. This deck looks to use Hate Bears to not only slow down their opponents, but also be relevant swingers for Tymna. There are also other non-Hate Bear based stacks pieces, which look to prey on and slow down the popular archetypes and decks of the current meta. This deck uses Kiki-Jiki and Splinter Twin lines to eventually win the game, commonly using Birthing Pod to tutor up a series of creatures to get to Kiki-Jiki and the payoff very early on. Joseph's opening hand contained a Snow-Covered Swamp, a Bloodstained Mire, an Ancient Tomb, a Mana Crypt, a Deathrite Shaman, an Eladamri's Call, and a Fire Covenant. Going third is Adam playing Yisan the Wanderer Bard. This toolbox mono green deck looks to control the board and stop his opponents from winning with pieces like Collector Oof, Null Rod, and other valuable creatures that he can play early and quick, and also tutor out with Yisan, all while looking for a series of creatures that will allow him to generate infinite mana, and then allow him to get infinite ETBs off of certain creatures like Crater of Behemoth or Regal Force. Adam's opening hand contained two Forests, an Ancient Tomb, a Gemstone Caverns, a Collector Oof, a Lightning Greaves, and a Master of the Wild Hunt. And finally, going last today is Jordan playing Rielle the Everwise. Rielle looks to generate massive card advantage by using the ability on Rielle to discard cards and draw an insane amount. So cards like Wheel of Fortune or Frantic Search now generate so much more card advantage than they did previously. Jordan's version of this deck looks to naturally storm off and win through an Aetherflux Reservoir. Jordan's opening hand contained a Prismatic Vista, a Steam Vents, an Academy Ruins, a Mystic Remora, a Dockside Extortionist, an Arcane Signet, and a Blood Moon. Now with the opening hands and deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Before the game starts, Adam has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a forest in order to have a luck counter on the caverns. Bill then goes to his turn, draws, plays a Mana Crypt for 0 mana, and then taps the Mana Crypt to cast an Arcane Signet. He then taps the Arcane Signet to cast a Fin-Torn Elves. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws, plays and cracks a Bloodstained Mire, paying 1 life in order to search up a Blood Crypt to the battlefield and pays 2 additional life to have it enter untapped. He then taps the Blood Crypt to cast a Deathrite Shaman. He then for 0 mana casts a Mana Crypt. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws, plays a Forest, and then taps both of his lands to cast a Collector Oof. And after slowing down Bill's risky keep, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws, plays a Prismatic Vista as his land for turn, and then pays 1 life to crack it to search up an island to the battlefield. He then taps that island to play a Mystic Remora. All through his turn, he gives the turn to the landless Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, sighs a Breath of Relief, and plays a Temple Garden, paying 2 life to have it enter untapped. He then taps for 1 green mana to cast an Elves of Deep Shadow. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and in his upkeep loses his mana crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws his card for turn, plays a snow-covered swamp, and then taps his Deathrite Shaman, exiling Jordan's Prismatic Vista to generate a colored mana to help cast his commander, Tymna the Weaver. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps his mana to cast a Master of the Wild Hunt, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and decides to, in his upkeep, pay 1 mana to keep Mystic Remora around, trying to get a little bit of value. He then plays an Academy Ruins as his land for turn, and then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then draws a card for turn. He pays 1 mana to cast a Dark Ritual. Jordan draws off of Mystic Remora, the ritual resolves and Bill floats 3 black mana. He then taps for a green mana to help cast an Abrupt Decay, targeting the Collector Oof. He does not pay the 4 extra, Jordan draws, and then the Collector Oof is destroyed. Bill then taps his mana to cast his own Tymna the Weaver, and then taps his mana rocks to cast a Blood Artist. With his turn completed, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then draws a card for turn. As his land, he plays an Exotic Orchard, and then he goes to combat and swings his 2/2 Tymna at Jordan. Jordan declares no blockers, Joseph gains 2 from the lifelink, and then in his second main phase, pays 1 life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. In his upkeep, Adam makes a 2/2 Wolf token from the Master of the Wild Hunt, and he then draws his card for turn, and then plays a Forest as his land for turn. He then takes 2 damage to tap his Ancient Tomb for mana in order to cast and equip Lightning Greaves to Master of the Wild Hunt. He does not pay for Mystic Remora, and Jordan draws. He then taps more of his mana to cast a Trinisphere. Jordan draws off of Mystic Remora, and with no further responses, the Trinisphere resolves. With nothing left, Adam gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep decides to pay for fish yet again because, looking at his mana, he realizes that without ramp he really could only cast 1 spell this turn anyway, and might as well get a little extra value. He then draws, plays a tapped Steam Vents as his land for turn, since he can't cast anything for 1 mana anyway, and then goes to his end step and discards due to hand size. Bill then goes to his turn and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and immediately goes to combat, swinging Tymna at Joseph and the Fin-Torn Elves at Jordan. In response to moving to blockers, Joseph pays 1 mana to activate his Deathrite Shaman to exile Jordan's Dispel to deal 2 damage to each opponent. He then, still in response to moving to blockers, taps his mana to flash out a Village Bellringer. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he untaps his creatures, and he then declares Village Bellringer as a blocker for Tymna. Jordan takes 1 damage off of the Fin-Torn Elves, Bill gains 2 life from the Tymna lifelink, and in his second main phase, Bill pays 1 life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger from 1 creature getting through. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Night's Whisper, taking 1 damage from his Elves of Deep Shadow, and on cast, Jordan draws off of Remora, and when it resolves, Bill takes 2 additional damage from the Night's Whisper. He then draws 2 cards, plays a Halls of Heliod's Generosity as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana due to the Trinisphere to cast a Blood Celebrant. With nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph pays 1 mana to activate his Deathrite Shaman, exiling Bill's Dark Ritual from his graveyard to deal 2 damage to each opponent. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then draws a card for turn. As his land, he plays a basic mountain and then decides to go to combat. In response to going to combat, Adam activates Master of the Wild Hunt in order to make his 2/2 Wolf and Joseph's Tymna fight. In response to this activation, Joseph pays 3 mana to cast a Fire Covenant, paying 7 additional life into it on cast. The targets for the 7 damage are 2 damage to the Wolf, 2 damage to Bill's Tymna, 1 damage to each of Bill's Mana Dorks, and 1 damage to Blood Artist. On cast, Jordan draws a card off of Mystic Remora, and then the Fire Covenant resolves, killing the creatures. As each of the creatures dies, Blood Artist triggers, and Bill decides to send all of the damage towards Joseph. Joseph takes 5, and Bill gains 5. Joseph then continues to go to combat since Tymna didn't have a wolf to fight against, and he swings Tymna at Jordan. Now, because of how fast we were playing at this point on the stream, Tymna never got re-tapped. If you noticed, before the Master of the Wild Hunt activation, Tymna had been tapped. We were playing a little bit quickly, so I wanted to explain why Tymna remains untapped for the rest of the turn cycle. It does not impact the game, I just wanted to clarify. Anyway, after damage is dealt and life is gained, Joseph pays 1 life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger, and he then passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps and in his upkeep makes another 2/2 wolf from Master of the Wild Hunt. He then draws and takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb to tap it for mana to help cast a Mana Crypt. He does not pay the extra. Jordan draws off of Mystic Remora, and Adam then taps for 3 mana to cast Yisan the Wanderer Bard. With nothing left, Adam gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep, again, really with nothing to do and with this Trinisphere really slowing him down, decides to again pay for fish. In his main phase, he plays a Fiery Islet as his land for turn, and then with nothing else, goes to his end step, discards down to hand size, and gives the turn to Bill. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage, and he then draws his card for turn. In his first main phase, he taps his mana to recast his commander, Tymna the Weaver, and then goes to combat and swings his Blood Celebrant at Jordan, who declares no blockers, takes a damage. Bill then, in his second main phase, takes 1 damage to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. Bill then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph taps his Deathrite Shaman to exile his own Bloodstained Mire to generate a mana to help cast a 3-mana Eladamri's Call due to the Trinisphere. Eladamri's Call resolves, and Joseph searches up a Kiki-Jiki to his hand. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, taking 3. He then draws a card for turn. He starts off this turn by playing and cracking a Verdant Catacombs to shock in an Overgrown Tomb. He then taps for 3 mana to cast an Abrupt Decay, targeting the 2/2 wolf. There are no responses, the wolf is destroyed, and Joseph then taps for 5 mana to cast Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. There are no responses to Kiki-Jiki, it resolves, and he then taps Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of Village Bellringer. When the new token copy enters the battlefield, it untaps all of Joseph's creatures, including Kiki-Jiki. Joseph then repeats this process in order to generate an infinite amount of hasty Village Bellringers, and he then goes to combat and swings enough at his opponents in order to win the game. So that wraps up game number 1, but before we get into game number 2, let's take a little bit of time to talk about the stacks piece in this game and how it really warped the game and not necessarily in Adam's favor. The Trinisphere that was played this game was played with the intention to keep Jordan off of mana, and really at the time that it was played, it appeared to be a good play. Jordan had a Mystic Remora and had been drawing some cards and getting some value, and it was clear that he was waiting to make some type of play that involved at least a few mana. So keeping him off of his cheap mana rocks and his cheap spells did a lot of work to keep Jordan out of the game completely. However, on the flip side, playing a Trinisphere into a deck that is built to play around Trinisphere, the Bloodpod list, my Bloodpod list plays Trinisphere. So having that on the battlefield really enabled me to be a bit more free to get around, especially the only blue player at the table. I don't necessarily blame Adam for that play, but just retroactively looking back at the game as a whole, it did enable me to have free reign over my spells, especially since I was pulling a lot of control spells and a lot of removal, so I had the answers that I needed for the few answers that were on board. The Fire Covenant and the Abrupt Decay really did a lot to save me that game, and not having to worry about Jordan, since he never really had 3 mana up to cast a single spell at any time in the game, really just allowed me to do what I needed. Now, if I didn't have that opportunity or the right cards in hand, Adam was in a good position to do what he needed to do and also not have to worry about Jordan. With Yisan on the battlefield and a solid piece of removal for Tymnas and other small creatures, Adam did have a fairly commanding board state if it wasn't for the pieces of removal I had. So like I said, the Trinisphere was a good play at the time, but just looking back at it, I do think it's interesting how certain stacks pieces can be used by other decks in order to gain an advantage, and that's something just to look out for if you're playing a deck that runs these stacksy or these pieces that slow or grind the game down. Anyway, enough of game number 1, let's get into game number 2. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this game is a little less serious than our normal games. For stream, we like to put decks together that maybe aren't completely optimal, but either have sentimental value or we think will be fun or interesting or different, and this game is an example of that. Nate's bringing a deck to the table that is quite different than we normally see, and it's a commander that he had built a while ago in casual and decided to power it up and see what it could do. But without any further ado, let's get into the deck introductions. Going first is Joseph playing Opus Thief, which uses the partner commanders Tymna the Weaver and Crom Ludovic's Opus in order to generate massive value and payoff off of wheels, using something like a Wheel of Fortune and a Smothering Tithe or a Waste Not or a Notion Thief in order to make sure that his hand is full and his resources are healthy, all while draining his opponent's hands. This deck eventually wins off of a Demonic Consultation Thassa's Oracle line. Joseph's opening hand contained an Ancient Tomb, a Flooded Strand, a Watery Grave, a Chain of Vapor, a Talisman of Progress, a Suppression Field, and due to the London Mulligan, he put a Shivan Reef to the bottom. Going second is Nate playing Yargle, Glutton of Urborg. Now, this mono-black deck doesn't try to do much else than just smack. This is somewhat Voltron, and it really just looks to power up Yargle, give him protection, and then eventually win by pressuring life totals, and then eventually win through either commander or regular combat damage. Nate's opening hand contained 3 Swamps, an Ancient Tomb, a Dark Depths, a Mana Vault, and a Thrall Retainer. Going third is Bill playing Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. This list looks to generate infinite mana and then infinitely cast Kroxa in order to make his opponents discard their hand and then eventually take damage for each cast. This infinite mana is normally generated through using a World Gorger Dragon combo, effectively blinking all of his permanents as many times as he wants, but there are backup lines in here including Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Wheel of Fortune. Now, being a combo deck in not blue can sometimes be a little difficult, so this deck looks to grind out the game and really just utilize opponent discard in order to keep his opponent's hands empty so he can combo off when he needs to. Cards like Waste Not and Siphon Mind and other just generic discard cards are very strong in this list. Bill's opening hand contained a Swamp, a Vampiric Tutor, a Sensei's Divining Top, a Shenanigans, a Buried Alive, a Siphon Mind, and due to the London Mulligan, he put an Ancient Tomb to the bottom of his library. And finally, going last in this game is Adam playing the same Yisan deck as the previous gameplay. Adam's opening hand contained 3 Forests, a Gaia Reach Sanitarium, a Once Upon a Time, a Sphere of Resistance, and a Sakura Tribe Scout. Now with the opening hands and the deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Joseph starts this game by drawing, playing an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then tapping it, taking 2 damage, to cast a Talisman of Progress. He then gives the turn to Nate. Nate draws, plays a Swamp, and then taps that Swamp to cast a Mana Vault. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws, plays a Forest, and since it's the first spell he cast this game, casts a Once Upon a Time for 0 mana. He looks at the top 5 cards of his library and decides to put an Elvish Spirit Guide into his hand. He then taps his Forest and exiles this Elvish Spirit Guide to cast a turn 1 Sphere of Resistance. With nothing left, Adam gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Watery Grave as his land for turn, and pays 2 life to have it enter untapped. He then taps for 3 mana due to the Sphere of Resistance to cast a Suppression Field. Suppression Field resolves and Joseph gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps out completely, taking 2 damage from the Ancient Tomb to cast a turn 2 Yargle, Glutton of Urborg. That is a sentence I didn't think I'd ever say on this channel. However, with Yargle on the battlefield, Nate gives the turn to Bill. Bill goes to his turn, draws, plays a Graven Cairns as his land for turn, and then, with nothing left, gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, plays a Forest, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Sakura Tribe Scout. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Flooded Strand, and decides to hold up some mana and gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then draws, plays a Swamp, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Thrall Retainer targeting his Yargle. Now, we did momentarily forget about the Sphere, but that mana does get tapped later on in the game, and it does not make an impact. Nate then goes to combat and swings his beefed up commander at Joseph. In response to moving to blockers, Joseph taps for 2 mana, floating a colorless and taking 2 damage off of Ancient Tomb to cast a Chain of Vapor targeting Yargle. Chain of Vapor resolves, Yargle gets bounced, and before moving to second main phase, Joseph taps for an additional mana to crack his fetch land to search up a tapped Steam Vents to the battlefield. This cost was because of Suppression Field being on the battlefield. With nothing left to do on his turn, however, Nate gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Reflecting Pool as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Talisman of Indulgence. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, plays a Forest, and then, with nothing to do, gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Godless Shrine as his land for turn, paying 2 life to have it enter untapped, and then taps for 6 mana, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to cast one of his partner commanders, Crom Ludovic's Opus. He then goes to combat and swings Crom at Bill, and Bill declares no blockers, takes the damage, and Joseph then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and he then draws his card for turn. He starts his turn by playing a Swamp as his land. He then taps for 4 mana to cast a Read the Bones, taking 2 from Ancient Tomb in order to scry 2, draw 2, and then lose 2 life off of the resolution. Nate then pays 1 mana to cast a Mana Crypt, and since it was the second spell he cast this turn, Joseph draws a card off of Crom. With nothing left, Nate gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then casts a Shenanigans, targeting the Sphere of Resistance. The sphere is destroyed, and Bill goes to pass the turn to Adam, and on Bill's end step, Adam pays 2 mana to activate his Sakura Tribe Scout in order to put a Gaia Reach Sanitarium onto the battlefield. Adam then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Forest, and then taps his mana to cast a Master of the Wild Hunt. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Fiery Islet as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast Tymna the Weaver. He then goes to combat and swings Crom at Bill, who declares no blockers, takes the damage, and then in his second main phase, Joseph pays 1 life to draw 1 card. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then also in his upkeep pays 4 mana to untap his Mana Vault, taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb. He then plays a Dark Depths as his land for turn and taps his mana to cast a Phyrexian Arena. The Arena resolves and Nate goes to pass the turn to Bill, and in Nate's end step, Bill taps for 1 black mana to cast a Vampiric Tutor. The Tutor resolves, Bill searches up a card to the top of his library, loses 2 life, and still in Nate's end step, seeing what's going on, Joseph taps his mana to cast the Wear side of Wear Tear, targeting Bill's Talisman in an attempt to keep him off of, hopefully, what is much needed mana. The artifact is destroyed, Bill goes to his turn, and instead of drawing in his draw step, decides to dredge his Shenanigans, milling a World Gorger Dragon to his graveyard, and returning Shenanigans to his hand. He then, for 2 mana, casts a Cabal Ritual. It resolves, he floats 3 black mana, and he then uses this black mana to cast a Necromancy. The Necromancy resolves and reanimates the World Gorger Dragon in Bill's graveyard. Now, Bill has a loop online by having the World Gorger Dragon enter the battlefield, exile all of his permanents, which includes Necromancy. The Necromancy leaves, World Gorger Dragon leaves, and then Necromancy comes back, allowing him to blink all of his permanents, tapping his mana in response to each exile effect, and essentially generating infinite mana. Now when Bill has enough mana to do what he needs to do, he uses some of this infinite mana to cast a Fire Covenant to kill the World Gorger Dragon in response to one of the Enter the Battlefield effects. The World Gorger Dragon is destroyed, and then Bill's permanents all get exiled. However, he still does have infinite mana. With this infinite mana, he's able to cast Kroxa. Kroxa will then die from the Enter the Battlefield effect, and he'll choose to put it back into his command zone, essentially being able to infinitely cast Kroxa. With each of the ETBs, his opponents will each have to discard a card from their hand, and they'll eventually start taking 3 damage each time, so he just recasts Kroxa to deal enough damage to his opponents to win the game. Now, we occasionally get asked if we think that Voltron can really ever have a place in cEDH or even higher powered, and I think this game really shows the issue or the biggest fault with these types of decks. Even with a very fast 5 mana 9/3 on the board, your plays are clearly projected and it's really easy to deal with. Casting a 5 mana commander and enchanting it with an aura all through a Sphere of Resistance by turn 3 all got stopped by a 1-mana Chain of Vapor. Now, I'm not saying that Voltron never has a spot in higher powered. It definitely is too slow for cEDH, but you could definitely sneak a few wins in a higher powered pod if they're not completely optimized decks. However, there are some very obvious faults, so without proper protection or an easy way to rebuild, you're going to kind of struggle no matter how good your start is. That being said, I don't have too much more to say about this game other than just always make sure to tap your mana correctly and be aware of what's on the board. Now, I was playing the Opus Thief deck, and it's very obvious, since I had the Wear Tear in hand, that if I had tapped mana for Tymna differently, that game goes an entirely different direction. However, I just got a little too tunnel visioned on preserving some of my life. I have quite a few cards in this Opus Thief deck that requires life, like Ad Nauseam and Necropotence, by not tapping the Fiery Islet and still being able to bluff some counter magic with the Steam Vents without having to take damage. However, that narrow focus and I'll even say lack of threat assessment really just gave Bill kind of an open door to do whatever he wanted, since I didn't have a counter spell in hand. Now, he didn't know that, but the piece of control I did have in my hand, I just wasn't able to use correctly. And this really just comes back to threat assessment. Now, looking back, if we're going to assess this game properly turn by turn, the turn before Bill won, he destroyed the Sphere of Resistance with shenanigans. In hindsight, it should be relatively obvious that Bill was trying to do something, because he had taken most of his turns up until that point off. So he either kept a hand that really had no gas at all, or he really needed to start putting his permanents down in order to get a board state, or in this case, win the game. So it's always a good idea to keep an eye on the person who tries to remove a stacks piece, because chances are they have a hand that can capitalize on that stacks piece being gone. So if they remove it, just keep a closer eye on them and plan your plays accordingly. That being said, that is all we have for this video. We hope you did enjoy it. If you do want to watch these games live, again, head on over to twitch.tv/casuallycompetitivemtg. We're streaming twice a week, and even when we start meeting back up in person again, we're going to do our best to continue to stream twice a week over there. So head on over if that's something that interests you. But that being said, that is all we have. I am Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.